Hello, my name is Roger Watson. I'm the Professor of Nursing from the Faculty of Health in the University of Hull. This session is for the HYMS Medicine with a Gateway year for the module Academic Scholarship, and this is the second of 2 lectures on writing for different purposes. This session is about using Twitter and blogging. On the handout you've already got some links. Not all of these will be referred to in the lecture. It's meant to be some other material that you can look at. I'll cover all of the topics that are listed on the handout in this session. At the end there's a challenge about, if you haven't already got a Twitter account, setting one up and using it, and I hope you find the session useful. Thank you very much. Writing for different purposes, Twitter and blogging. This is Roger Watson from the University of Hull. The contents of this lecture on blogging and tweeting will be as follows. First of all, I'll have a look at the power of social media, then the effective use of Twitter, effective blogging, making social media work, and finally being professional on social media. First of all, the power of social media. Social media leads to this new word, infodemiology. What we mean by infodemiology is something that demonstrates the power of social media generally. For example, on Twitter, tweets predict citations of academic papers. Search engine queries predict outbreaks of influenza. Tweets during the H1N1 pandemic, Asian bird flu, correlated with incidence rates. Nearer to home, it was clear on Chinese social media that there were increased inquiries about some of the symptoms, which then turned out to be the coronavirus 2 or COVID-19. And more prosaically, tweets about a movie can accurately predict its success at the box office prior to the initial screening. Now I'm going to show you a YouTube called Socialnomics, and it's from 2013, mainly focused on Twitter and Facebook. There are many other social media sites in use since then, principally Instagram. One thing I do want to get across in this session is that Twitter is still very much used by academics and can be used by students to find information, and also the use and the power of blogging. So this is slightly out of date, so you can assume that nearly all the figures here have increased since this time. So it's a very interesting video. It takes a few minutes to run, so let's run it. Well, I hope you found that interesting. It's slightly out of date, as I say. It does get updated year on year, but that's one of the best ones, I think. You can tell it's a bit out of date because some of the websites like Pinterest and Flickr and others are probably not used all that much these days. Twitter is certainly still very much used, as is Facebook, and of course other websites like Instagram and other Snapchat and other things like that have come in since then. Interesting that it pointed out that China is not keen on Google-based platforms. I work a great deal in China, and that's absolutely true. Unless you're very lucky or you're in certain hotels, you can't log into Google-based platforms. You can, however, get into them illegally using what are called virtual private networks. If you've got a good one, you can normally get in. You're not supposed to, but many people do. China used to have an equivalent to Twitter called Weibo, but that's not used at all now. Mostly they use WeChat. Mentioned LinkedIn there and how big it is. LinkedIn is still quite important for linking people together. I'm not sure how much LinkedIn is really used apart from advertising what you do and making contacts. It's a shame that LinkedIn's been discovered by a great many sort of predatory companies and predatory publishers who put out links to predatory conferences and things like that, which is not so good. YouTube, the sheer number of videos that go up every day on YouTube is enormous, and it's, as it said there, it's becoming one of the biggest search engines, if not the biggest search engine in the world. Very true to say that products find us rather than us having to find them. I don't know how much this influences the academic world, but I know it's interesting to note that if I search for something on Google, particularly a product, or if I go on Amazon via my Google Chrome site, as soon as I go back on Instagram, those particular products are being pushed out to me on Instagram. It's a little bit irritating. It can be a little bit eerie, to be honest, but that's the world we live in. I don't think anybody's suggesting that we really don't do without social media. I think it's almost impossible these days. You just have to learn to be very careful on it. And finally, I've been to Egypt, but I've never met anyone called Twitter or Facebook. I'm assuming that was true, but I'm not actually sure. First of all, let's have a look at Twitter. Some of you may already use Twitter, although I find in the younger generation, particularly amongst my children, for example, that Twitter use is not very high. They tend to use Instagram and Snapchat, but I'd like to encourage you to think about using Twitter if you haven't already got an account. Twitter's an American microblogging and social networking service. I'm sure you knew that. Users can post and interact with messages that are known as tweets. People who are registered with a Twitter account can post, like and retweet material, but people who don't have an account can only read them. So anybody can actually look at Twitter. That's worth remembering. If you do have a Twitter account, if there's things that you don't want to be seen, you've got to make sure that you don't put them up there or that you make your account private or whatever. But there's really not much point in having a private Twitter account. I think people are on Twitter so that people know what they're thinking and what they want to put up there. It's called a micro-blogging platform, which of course means that blogging preceded it, but we'll come to blogging later. Just out of interest, this is a slide that shows the power of retweeting things, and this is the real value of Twitter and of other social media sites as well, but particularly noticeable and particularly demonstrable through Twitter. By retweeting things, they get amplified over time and very quickly as well. So for example, here's one tweet by a magazine called Digital Woman, nothing to do with academic work, to a couple of thousand followers, and then someone called Brett with 7,000 followers then retweets that out, and other people pick it up and it's retweeted another couple of times, by which time there are nearly 20,000 people who've received that message. Now, not everyone will have read that message, but just imagine if 10% of them do, and if, say, another 1% click on the actual website and buy something. I can't do the mathematics in my head, but that's a lot more people than would have bought something had they not seen that tweet. So it's a particularly powerful way of advertising and a particularly powerful way of getting information out. Of course, that's the value to academics, is that they can use it to advertise essentially their work and put out links to their papers, their publications. And of course, as consumers of that, other academics and indeed students, undergraduate and postgraduate students, can make use of that. It's a very nice way to keep up with what people are saying and to find up-to-date information. Twitter started about maybe 15 years ago, and this is again slightly out of date. I couldn't find a more up-to-date one, but this is the use of Twitter over roughly 6-year period, and it shows how the use has increased pretty dramatically. These are millions of people on the left hand, the y-axis, but of course, like everything else, it's plateauing out. And I believe if we took this up to the present day, we might see some slight decline in the use of Twitter generally, of course, because other websites have come into use. However, amongst the academic community, it's still a very important way of sharing information. Apparently, 1 in 40 scholars in the US and UK use Twitter, and that number continues to grow. I don't know what it is exactly now. I can't remember. This is a few years, maybe a couple of years out of date. It may be more now. And I know that newspapers like the Times Higher Education Supplement have strongly pushed the use of social media. They use it themselves. They've had articles advising academics on how best to use social media and Twitter in particular. But most academics only interact professionally with other people in their field or their subfield. But some don't. Notably, for example, during the current pandemic that's ongoing at the time I'm giving this lecture. Hopefully, if somebody's listening to this in the future, it will be over. But during the pandemic, some academics came to the fore, possibly particularly one or two who questioned the orthodoxy of the lockdowns and some of the procedures that we were taking. For instance, Carl Hennigan at the University of Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine on his Twitter site questioned some aspects of it. They became pilloried by some, lauded by others, but by whatever means, they also became quite well known. But most academics just use it to share information within their field. It's interesting to note, but perhaps worth saying here, that of course Twitter has taken people off and blocked their accounts if they've said things that are inappropriate, including academics who say things that may not be very popular. That's a controversial point, but you're best to play safe on social media, perhaps not be too controversial, or you might find your Twitter account blocked. So why do academics use Twitter? I got this off from Google Images. It's from a blog about the use of Twitter, and they don't necessarily use it professionally. Some use it for curiosity only. The most common use is to follow discussions, but other people use it to track metrics of their papers, looking for jobs, looking for peers who might be involved in their own work, discovering, recommending papers and so forth. And again, one of the most common use, or nearly one of the most common uses there, next to following discussions, is posting their own work and their own content. And but there's all sorts of uses that are put to by Twitter. Up in the top left there you see commenting on research, and that's becoming increasingly common. I think that might be another more common use now. For example, it's become much more common to post preprints of articles that are written and have been submitted for publication. A preprint is a version of an article, for instance on medRxiv, that hasn't been refereed but is put out under open science agreements, so that people can get early access to the information but can also comment on the paper. And under the paper there are comment sites, and Twitter is one of the sites that's very commonly used to comment on the papers. Just as a bit of light relief, I don't know if you've ever come across this American website called PhD Comics, but it's a website that really makes fun of academic life. Sometimes it's very funny. I think this is quite a good one, why academics really use Twitter. In fact, it's used exactly the same slide, and it's said things like to avoid writing, and gives you something to do during boring seminars, to procrastinate, such like. Looking for a job in case I get fired or denied tenure. That's a very American expression. There's no tenure in the UK these days, but you can see interact with people I've got an intellectual crush on, or gossip about people in my field. Anyway, that's not true. It's meant to be a joke. So, how do we use Twitter effectively? The first way to be useful on Twitter is to make sure that your tweets contain links, and I will show you what a link looks like. By a link, I mean a link to another URL, to something else that's online. That URL can be to a newspaper article, an academic paper, a blog, or even to a YouTube channel. It can be to almost anything. But the best tweets definitely contain links. Here's one of my tweets from fairly recently, and it's about the pandemic, and it's got a link at the bottom, and the link is to a YouTube channel. And I'm just saying here, doesn't pull any punches about how Britain has done badly on mortality. It's when he started as a doctor. This is the person in the YouTube. There were 300,000 beds in the NHS, now 130,000. So what I'm doing is sort of paraphrasing what's in there, using a phrase, and some numbers, which will perhaps make it easy for people to read and understand what it's about. But if they want to know more, they can listen to the whole YouTube. So that's one way to use a link. But as I say, a link can be to anything that's online, anything with a URL. Now, tweets can also be linked to pictures, by which I mean you can upload pictures on Twitter. And you can do this either with a message or without a message. If the picture is explicit, for example a cartoon with a caption underneath it, you probably don't need to put up a message with it. Sometimes you might want to do it. Pictures are very useful at drawing attention to your content, and you'll almost never see, for example, links to newspaper articles on Twitter without a picture in it. I'm going to show you later that newspapers actually provide links that automatically put pictures up from their feed. I'll show you that later. But what I want to just show you here is just how you can use a picture on Twitter. It's quite simple. So this is an example of a picture. There's no message with this tweet, purely the picture, because it's self-explanatory. And I've got to show it over two PowerPoint slides because it's too long to show on one. And this was sent to me by my daughter during the pandemic. She's at university, and this is how to attend an online class. So step 1, turn off your microphone, and step 2, turn off your camera. Step 3, fall asleep. So I don't know if my daughter actually does that during her university lectures. I don't think she does, because they're very active. She's doing performing arts, but people may well be doing this during my lectures. I wouldn't know. You can put up more than one picture on a tweet. There is a limit. I can't remember how many it is, but you can put up quite a few. The other thing that you can do on pictures is you can actually tag people to the pictures. You can tag 5 people per picture, and that means putting in what's called their Twitter handle, that @ with their Twitter name next to it. As you can do in messages as well, you can put people's Twitter handles into messages. If you do, that's called tagging them, and that actually sends the message directly to their feed, and it makes sure that they will see it. So it's a good way of starting a conversation, one way to start a conversation. And just for completeness, you can also have conversations off Twitter. You can send direct messages. You have to be following that person and they have to be following you back to do direct messaging. And on direct messaging, there's no limit to the size of the messages, and it can be used very effectively to communicate with people. Some people see this as their preferred way of communicating. I find it a very useful way. For example, nothing to do with pictures, and I'm getting a bit sidetracked here, but I find the direct messaging facility a very, very useful way to correspond with, for example, British Airways and Cathay Pacific, the airlines I use. If you want to get attention from a company, a good way is to put a tweet out and tagging them in, and they'll very quickly get back to you, ask you to go to direct message, and 9 times out of 10 you can get things solved much more quickly than emailing or telephoning. So Twitter is exceedingly powerful from that point of view. Another way to put pictures on Twitter is to use links from online newspapers, and as I've already said, they nearly always provide the kind of URL links that will automatically put up a picture. I've got no idea how they do that. So for example, this comes from an online free newspaper called Unheard, which provides free content about how lockdowns don't protect the elderly. All I did here was put in my message at the top, which is actually a direct quote from the article. And that quote alone wouldn't have had much effect, I don't think. People may have wondered, why is he saying that? That's just his opinion. But what I did at the foot of that was put in the URL for that article, and it appears like this. The URL doesn't appear, a picture appears. If you click on that picture anywhere, then that takes you to the article. So this is a very powerful way to link to online content. It also shows the importance that newspapers put on the use of social media, and particularly Twitter, if you're putting things out on Twitter. These sort of links will also work on Facebook. They won't work on Instagram unless you have a paid account or you're a particularly important celebrity when they open up the account for live URLs. And I think the URL links are clever enough to know whether the content is going up on Facebook or Twitter, and they format the pictures accordingly. So again, a very powerful and very useful way to put out content. Very often you don't even need to put in a message. The headline usually says it all. Another way to be useful on Twitter is to use hashtags. If you've ever been on Twitter, you'll have seen hashtags. They also work on Facebook, and they also work on Instagram. They may well work on other platforms, I don't know, but those are the only platforms that I use. But many people don't understand hashtags, and it's not necessary to use them all the time, but it's useful if you want to gather what you're saying together into a conversation. And hashtags are also particularly useful to find things that you're interested in. For example, I follow the local football team, Hull City FC. The hashtag HCFC on a Saturday afternoon takes you to progress of the match. And in actual fact, the progress on Twitter is often quicker than listening to the progress on the radio, almost back to our infodemia. People are tweeting out immediately all the time what's happening in the match, and I find it a very useful way to keep up with the match. It also gives you some insight from supporters who are at the match, and you can interact with people as well. So you've probably seen hashtags. That's what a hashtag looks like. But what are hashtags? Well, according to Twitter support, people use the hashtag symbol before a relevant keyword or phrase with no spaces in it in their tweet to categorize those tweets and help them show more easily in a Twitter search. And clicking on a hashtag word in any message will show you all the other tweets marked with that keyword. So it's a very, very useful way to gather things together and make content and conversations easily available. when we're having online chats, for example, around certain issues. For example, there are various, I'm a nurse, there are various nursing forums, Nurse Online, Nurse Chat, things like that, and they will set up discussions at a particular time of the evening about a particular issue, for example, understaffing in intensive care or whatever, and they will give a hashtag for that conversation and try to make it unique. Hashtags aren't always unique. Sometimes, hashtag nurse is very general. It will bring in all sorts of information about nurses and nursing. But if yours is about staffing levels in ICU, hashtag staff level ICU, something like that, that's unlikely to be used by other people. And you can follow the conversation as it's taking place and indeed contribute to it, and that's the idea. So that's one way that hashtags can be used. They're also used copiously, as I say, to pool conversations together, as I'm going to show in the next slide. So here's an example. This happens to be it's Jan. You don't see the J there, but JAN, that green and blue strapline, is the Journal of Advanced Nursing, which I used to edit, in fact. And there was an article written there, as it happens, by Philip Derbyshire. He's down at the bottom left, and it was about the thriller elite, and it was the elite members of nursing who particularly inspired Philip and another co-author. And to bring these together, Philip created the hashtag Thriller Elite, and he used it in retweets of those articles. I'll talk about retweeting later, and in tweets about the article. And of course this gets picked up, and the conversation around this, which was not at a particular time but to some extent is still continuing, was people were able to add to it, having read the article and gone to Twitter and said, I think so-and-so was an inspiration, or I agree with you about so-and-so, and putting it up there with Thriller Elite. So it's still there if you hashtag Thriller Elite. And notice in the third one down by Laurie Bickoff, Thriller Elite has a capital T, doesn't make any difference. Twitter is not case sensitive. Try to minimize trivia on Twitter. I'm afraid I'm as guilty of this as anyone, but it's not very useful all the time. Certainly, if you're a professional, if you're cramming your Twitter feed full of trivial information, you've got to try and play to your audience. I'm not saying never do it, and I'm not saying never try to be humorous or say what you're feeling about something, but you do have to be careful, and I'll come back to talking about professionalism and the use of Twitter near the end. Here's an example from my own Twitter feed from a few years ago. A couple of tweets in a row, in fact, on September the 28th. I must have been in a particularly bad mood, but I was oh yes, that's right, there was American football on television. I'm sorry for anybody who likes American football. I just cannot get into it at all. And I put up that the Antiques Roadshow, which I do happen to like a great deal, was much more exciting than American football. And I said I was watching the Raiders versus the Dolphins, some sort of Super Bowl game, I think, that happened to be on British TV, possibly being played at Wembley. And I just said, does anybody know what the heck is going on? Hashtag Hull City AFC, which is the hashtag for my football team. It ain't. So anyway, that's just an example of trivia. But it's, as I say, don't cram your Twitter feed full of trivia. It really doesn't help. Retweeting material is a good thing to do. That's the retweet symbol there. It's down at the bottom of all tweets. Retweeting material is a good way to show other people that you're interested in their content, and people notice that you retweet their content and will possibly then follow you as a result. And you do want to build up a following on Twitter. Don't worry about people following you. If you think someone's following you inappropriately, then you can always block them. That's quite easy to do. But you are trying to gather a following together. So retweeting material that you find interesting is useful. It can be retweeted without comment, and these days it can be retweeted with a comment. You can take back a retweet without a comment but once you've commented, you can't take that back again. You've got to go and delete the actual tweet. If someone else retweets it or makes a screenshot of it, and there's something perhaps inappropriate in it, you're too late. So you do have to be careful. And as I said, regarding any material that you put a link in, to be sure that you're retweeting accurately. In other words, that you're retweeting things that are genuinely of interest, are not offensive, and really represent your viewpoint. So do check what people say. Some people are actually quite good at linking to material that may not be what you want to retweet, or you may not want to be propagating, but it looks like it is, and you retweet it, and then the link goes out and other people read it and say, actually, as I've said already, some people will get back and say, actually, have you read that material you retweeted? I don't think it conveyed what you really thought it did. And of course, you have to be careful. There are not very much of it, but there are links to pornographic material, dating sites, things like that, that come out looking innocent. And as I say, do check links before you retweet, and check the tweet as well. So here's something that I retweeted while I was in Hong Kong. It says at the top, Roger Watson retweeted. This was from the South China Morning Post, and this was during, there was trouble in Hong Kong at the time, but Occupy Hong Kong. It was during the umbrella protests over democracy in Hong Kong, and I happened to be there at the time. I've been there twice during those particular occupations and riots, and tension was very high in the city, and I was living just in a district next to Mong Kok. I was living in Yau Ma Tei, just down the road from there, so this was fairly close to where I was. So that's retweeted, no comment, just retweeted, but I could have made a comment had I wanted to. You find, if you just see just below that, it's also got Roger Watson retweeted something else, and above that it's a retweet as well. I think a great deal of what we actually put out on Twitter is retweeting, and some people only seem to retweet material. They never share their own opinion. Doesn't really matter. And very important at the bottom, I'm going to come back to talk about being professional later on, but I'll say now, don't be offensive on Twitter. There's absolutely no need to be. That doesn't mean to say you can't argue with people at all. People will be offensive to you. You really have to try not to respond in kind. I have to say it's difficult sometimes, and there are some occasions when I think I've perhaps responded inappropriately to a tweet myself. You do have to be careful. Those of you who like to perhaps have a glass of wine in the evening, it's probably best not to be tweeting once you've had your second glass of wine. It clouds your judgment, and you've got to be very, very careful. So don't be offensive, but particularly for you as potential first year medical students, MBCHB students, you have to be very careful about, as nurses do, the what I would call the career-ending tweet, the one that will lose you your job. And the university and your professional bodies, General Medical Council, bodies like that, will have guidance on the use of social media. Do check it. And again, I will come back to this because it's very important, and I don't want to frighten you. It's very easy to avoid doing stupid things on Twitter. Just don't do them. But some people don't go on for fear of this, but I think that's not a valid approach to social media. I think you've just got to be professional and careful. And for example, as medical, clinical professionals, nurses and doctors and others, must never tweet anything about a patient. And you've got to be very careful about tweeting anything about your clinical situation in your hospital. At the best of times, the National Health Service doesn't like information getting out about understaffing or difficult shifts or because of things or whatever. You can by all means share your own reflections and your own feelings about things, but don't say I was on the ward today and there was absolutely this terrible incident happened or whatever, and there's just not enough staff in my NHS trust. don't put out stuff like that. As accurate as it may be and as fair as it may sound, they don't like it, and people do get prosecuted or at least disciplined, should I say, by the National Health Service. In your case, you may well be disciplined by the university. So please, I'm not trying to frighten you, but it does happen, and we've had cases of nurses being discontinued, for example, from the profession and from their studies as a result of inappropriate tweets and inappropriate use of other social media. So next I want to talk about blogging and effective blogging. So what exactly is a blog? Well, as it says here, and I've taken this from a website called What is a Blog? Probably in itself a blog. A blog is an online diary or a journal located on a website. The content of a blog typically includes texts, pictures, videos, animated GIFs, and even scans from old physical offline diaries or journals and other hard copy documents. Since a blog can exist merely for personal use, sharing information with an exclusive group, or to engage the public, a blog owner can set their blog for private or public access. So essentially a blog is a website, and you're all familiar with websites. But the great thing about a blog is it's much more flexible, and you have much more control over it as a blogger. Occasionally people like myself write for other blogs, and we don't have control over what goes up on the blog necessarily, but we can get it changed fairly quickly. But just as an example, if there's something wrong on the University of Hull webpage, it can take weeks to get it changed. It's a very long process, putting in a request, going to the webmaster, having it approved and such like. Whereas on a recent research project of mine for the Burdett Trust for Nursing, the STAR project on WordPress, we could change that within the day. If we noticed an error, I could log in and change it that same day. We could take down posts, put up new ones, alter them in any way we wanted. So the great thing about a blog is its flexibility. Just to clarify further, blogs versus websites, what's the difference? In most cases, non-blogging websites are updated with new content less frequently than associated blog pages and blog-devoted websites. And that's exactly what I was saying. It's much easier to update a blog than to update a website. Blogs typically receive weekly, daily, or even less than hourly updates. Non-blog websites, such as individual personal interest, biography and business sites, typically update their news content much less frequently and then add new pages or update some content, but only when they need it. Blogs also promote discussion, and many newspapers, for example, The Conversation, the Times Higher Education newspaper, and even some of the daily newspapers that are put out as blogs or in blog format have got discussion areas underneath them. These are essentially blogs. So they've got comment sections designed to create online conversations about blog content and blog owners in a similar fashion as comment sections provided to readers by news media platforms and other publishers under online articles. I think it's absolutely true to say that the online newspapers have copied the blog format and used that flexibility. And of course you can't just make any comments. Sometimes the comments go up immediately, sometimes they're monitored. If they go up immediately and they're deemed offensive or whatever, they can be edited and taken down, of course, by the editor of that particular blog. So blogs and websites, very similar, but they do have some essential differences and they're used for different purposes. Also, for anyone blogging, the difference between a blog and a page, or a blog post on a page, you need to know about this. So for example, you can create a blog site, for example on WordPress or on Blogspot or Blogger, which is the Google one, which I actually strongly recommend. There are lots of other ones available, but it's free and very flexible and easy to use. Create a blog site, but within that you can have several blogs, and then each time you put something up on the blog, that's actually a posting or a page. So there are different levels. So all of your blogs can be gathered together at one URL, but under that URL there will be many different blogs. So for example, I blog about nursing education and nursing workforce. They're completely separate blogs with their own postings. I blog about teaching anatomy and physiology. That's another blog. And I blog about poetry, and that's another blog within my blog site. So you've got to be careful that every time you create a posting, you don't go and create a new blog, because then somebody has to come out and go into it again. You can add postings to your blog, and I'm sure you've been on blogs and seen this, and you can scan down and easily find the other postings. So who blogs? What kind of people blog? Well, there's almost no limitation on the type of people who blog. They're just people like you and me. If you blog, you're known as a blogger, and they, or we, come from all walks of life and backgrounds and from all across the world. And of course, there are blogs in different languages. As long as somebody's got access to the internet and that can enable them to make web page content, they can make a blog and they can promote it to attract readers. Typically promote it through the use of social media or adding it to the signature line on their emails or whatever. Most common bloggers include individuals who want simply to share personal information about themselves or their interests and hobbies with the world. And I think that's true. A great many blogs are just personal interest blogs about hobbies, running, sports, collectors, that kind of thing. However, there are a great many political blogs as well, and a great many academic blogs. Some of the best bloggers, certainly in my field, are academics who blog about issues in science, ethics, about science, and writing for publication, for example. Right, if you're going to be a blogger, you need to develop good habits, and I came across this site, which was the 8 habits of highly effective bloggers. Now, some of these are not necessarily applicable to academic blogging or blogging as a student, but nevertheless they show you the kind of habits that you need to develop. I think they're very useful. Effective bloggers are prolific. Don't want to let this put you off, but if you blog, there's nothing worse than people who blog once or twice or have a flurry of activity and then they never blog again. Very often people make a great start and then run out of ideas. You're not going to find that at all satisfying. You're not going to get followers or really generate any interest around your blog. You do need to be blogging quite regularly. You don't need to blog in every blog every day or every week, but you do need to be quite regular about it. Effective bloggers are concise. We mentioned this in the first session in these 2 lectures about concise writing. The best writing is always concise, and the best blogs are always concise. There is absolutely nothing worse than turning to a blog that scans on for page after page, and especially page after page of text. I'm going to show you an example of a blog page, an entry that I've done after this slide, and I think it's good, but it's good because I followed the guidance of other bloggers. Effective bloggers are analytical. You're not just reporting things, you are trying to share your opinion and your analysis of a situation. So for example, if a new government policy comes out regarding nursing education, for example, I want to write about that and say, why is this good? Why is it bad? Why have they done this? It's no good just putting up a blog and simply reporting something if you're blogging on your own behalf. I think you do need to say something that's interesting and different. And of course, not everyone will agree with you, and you've got to be prepared for that. Effective bloggers are lifelong learners. In other words, you're not fixed in your opinions and arrogant. You're trying to learn all the time. You're trying to show an interest and even an amazement at new things that come up, whether you agree with them or disagree with them. You're also trying to find new ways to blog and to be more effective with your blog. So there's no place in blogging for the crystallized opinions. You've really got to be quite dynamic and trying to keep up to date with things. Effective bloggers are focused and consistent. There is a tendency, perhaps within even one blog, to blog about too many things. My reflections on whatever, and you just go off about sport or your day or whatever. A blog has got to be about one area, and bloggers should be focused on one area. So clearly the mainstay of my blogging is about nursing, academic nursing and nursing policy, practice, education and employment. I do have other blogs as well, but they're for different audiences. But the main area of my blogs, which I, to be honest, haven't updated a great deal recently, but not exclusively, are about nursing education and nursing policy. Plan ahead. I think it's all very well to react to something that comes out. That can be a very good way to blog. It can be very stimulating, but it's also quite effective to plan ahead and think, well, what after I've done this, what would be my next blog? It's very easy to run out of steam, and I have to say on many of my blogs I haven't put an entry in for a long time. We're all guilty of this. That's not very effective practice. Effective bloggers plan ahead and think, well, when am I going to blog? And you do need to set time aside to do it. And it's a very important thing to do, to set time aside to do it. So set yourself aside an hour or half an hour when you're free to blog, and try and plan that into your schedule. And effective bloggers are persistent. They keep at it. As I say, there's nothing worse than going to a blog that's completely run out of steam and hasn't had an entry in it for, 5 or 6 years, and there are plenty of those. I don't want to point the finger at people particularly, but I can think of many senior university managers, not in our own university, I hasten to add, in other universities where I've worked, vice-chancellors and pro-vice-chancellors that have discovered blogging and thought this would be a great way to keep in touch with the staff and the student body, and they come in with a massive flourish and do a couple of blogs, and then you never hear from them again. That's a waste of time. And effective bloggers are self-starters. You don't need to be told to blog. You need to be self-stimulating, self-starting, motivated to do this. If you're not, then you will not be an effective blogger. And I'm not saying that everyone listening to this has to be an effective blogger or even has to blog at all. But if a couple of you take it up and find it a useful way to get your views across, get things off your chest and share information, and even to learn about things, then that will be a good thing. So you can check that site, the 8 Habits of Highly Effective Bloggers. There's more detail under each of these headings on that blog site. So, blowing my own trumpet, as they say, here's a blog entry from me. Just to give you the context, this is a blog entry on a blog called Jan Interactive. I don't edit this nursing journal any longer, but I used to until very recently, and I created a blog to run alongside the Twitter site with some help from my colleagues at Wiley, the publishers, who got it set up looking as it is there. You can set up blogs very nicely if you know how to do it, and some people are really good at doing it. I'm not, so it's worth getting some help if you can. So it's themed in the colour of the journal, for example, and also it's got the pages nicely down the side, so you can quickly get to content. My purpose in this blog was to use it for correspondence from authors, to stimulate discussion about some issues, but mainly to push out the content of the journal. And every now and again I would choose an article that interested me and I thought I could write about in a blog entry. And to me, I think this is almost a perfect blog entry here. Not all of them were quite so good. Some were longer than this, and sometimes I didn't get such attractive pictures, but this one's good because it's all on one page. It's got a title, sort of catchy title, e-learning or the old way. It's got who's written it, me and my my position in the journal. And what I've also done is said a little bit about myself. I'm an advocate of online learning, and I'm pointing to a course that I took, and there's a link to it, although I now know that that link is dead because that course is no longer run by the Sheffield College. But anyway, I did some training in online learning, and I've got a couple of pictures in there which tell you immediately what this is about, even if you don't read the article. And then I say that I came across this article by McCutcheon et al. It's in my journal as it happens. I've put a title in there and a hyperlink to the title. Don't ever put raw URLs into blogs. There's no need to do it. They're very unattractive and cumbersome. You can hypertext them, and it's very easy to do using the blogging facility. Then at the bottom I put a reference in, good academic practice, put the full reference in, and again hypertext the title. You can't see quite the full reference there. So everything that I needed to get across was done here on one page. I deliberately kept it short. I tried to write these to a formula, and just an example. But most of my blog entries some of them are longer than that, but most of them will have those features of a picture in them somewhere to break up the text, to make it attractive, to make it informative, and always with hyperlinks to other information, so you don't have to write about it. People can look it up for themselves. So next, I want to talk about making social media work. If you're serious about using social media, then you'll want to know how to make it work. And there are several blogs and websites that tell you about how to make your social media work. I'm going to give you 4 ideas here that seem to work for me. First thing is not to run your social networking sites in isolation. Of course, you may well have separate sites for personal material and professional material. That's natural. You've got to be careful what you put up where. It's not always necessary. I mean, the bottom line, as it were, is to be very careful wherever you're putting up social media content. But you can, for example, link your Twitter site to your Facebook, so all your tweets automatically appear on Facebook. And you can then discuss things on Facebook. It's easier to discuss things there. You've got unlimited space. It also prevents you from having to put everything up on Facebook. If you put it up on your Twitter site, it automatically goes up there. You can link blogs and YouTube to your Twitter site, and of course if you do that, you put up a YouTube or a blog, then it goes to your Twitter site and will appear also on your Facebook site. So you do have to be careful as well that that's what you really want. But that's one way in which to run them together. Try to develop a strategy for promoting your work and your profile. So a strategy could involve, for example, how frequently you tweet and who you tag into it, and how you want to get your profile out there and what the profile is that you are trying to promote. You've always got to be what's called legal, decent, honest and truthful, of course. Don't exaggerate, don't tell lies, don't put out anything that is inaccurate or unprofessional. But you can often get a surprise at how influential something that you've done can be. For example, a blog on some issue, and you tag someone that you may want to read it, somebody with quite a high profile, a journalist perhaps, or somebody else in the media, and sometimes they will read it and get back to you and comment on it. Not always favourably, but that's okay. I think we've said this before, but decide what your essential content is. What is it you're really blogging about and using social media for? What is it you want to be known for? Doesn't mean to say you can't write blogs about flower arranging if you happen to be a hardline scientist who wants to get content out on science, but you don't necessarily want to share that material with your other scientific colleagues. You want to share it somewhere else. So just take care to decide what it is you're really about, and people will get to know that. And as I say, some people will like it and some people won't. And then decide how you're going to get it out there, and in a way that's connected to the the first and second points above. But you can set up Twitter, for example, to send out regular tweets at certain times. There are various apps that you can use to do that. I tend not to use it. Some effective bloggers do. You've just got to watch that things don't get out of control. Some people get very tired if they get too much from you, so you do have to be a little bit careful about that. And some people send the same tweet out time and time and time again. Nothing wrong with sending the same tweet out again to make sure that it's seen and read, but just don't overdo it. But decide how you're going to get it out there. And it's one thing to write a tweet, it's one thing to link it to your Facebook, but how else will you get it out there? Are you going to put it out on your emails? Are you going to send it to people? Are you going to include it and cite it and other things that you're writing? Just decide how it's going to get from your mind and your blog out to other people. Always assuming that that's what you want to do and that you're not just blogging for your own entertainment. Now, I've mentioned a few times being professional on social media. Essential for clinical professionals like us to be professional, but it's essential for anyone in any profession. We've got to be very careful that we're not doing anything that brings discredit to us or to our profession. So extreme political views could be deemed offensive. You certainly don't want to make any remarks of a racial nature, not that you would, I'm sure, but you have to be careful not to join in on jokes that, while you may find them funny, could be seen as being offensive. So don't add to it and don't retweet material that others are likely to find offensive. You have to be very careful about gender, sexuality, and anything that could be considered offensive or to be looking down or making fun of any minority. And you certainly do not want to making fun of anybody in a particular disease group or people with mental health illnesses. You get the message. You just have to be very careful and very professional. I'll reiterate that it's absolutely out of the question tweeting anything about a patient. And while it's not strictly speaking out of the question, you have to be very careful about tweeting anything out or putting anything on Facebook about your place of work. Clearly anything that gives away any confidential information is completely forbidden, but you do have to be careful that you're also not bringing your employer or the university into disrepute. And believe me, there are pretty regular cases of people crossing this line, even though we make it clear to people at the beginning of their programs. So being professional is highly important. Another thing, and I've said this a few times, not everyone will like what you have put out there. And you can check my Twitter feed and you can see that I've had quite a few hot arguments with people. But in my opinion, I've never been personal, but other people have. And I think that is the key. Never be personal. Never try and attack the person. By all means, argue back against their ideas. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We have free speech in this country and we should use it. And you should also respect the other person's free speech. So don't try and shut people down. If someone says, I'll give you an example, which you may find controversial, many of my colleagues and many of my students do. I don't believe that it's necessary for nursing students, as we should strictly call them, to have a bursary. I don't think they should be privileged over and above other students. And I've expressed this in the conversation and tweeted it out, and it's been picked up. And periodically it gets picked up by someone. If you go to the conversation and look at my article, if you happen to have a login to the conversation, you will see copious comments on it. I got something like 200 comments initially on it. I responded to all of them, and to all of them politely without exception. The comments continue to pour in, and I feel bad that I haven't kept up with those comments, but I just can't. The volume is too great. But they're actually quite painful reading. People are very personal. They've told me they hate me, I ought to be sacked. They've reported me to the Vice-Chancellor. I've been accused of being a political extremist and all sorts of things. None of these things are just expressing an opinion. and giving an argument for it. And I've always been polite. And again, on Twitter, it's surfaced now and again. And I've had senior medics and senior nurses and parents of nurses just calling me all sorts of names. And I do mind, but I don't respond in kind. I always say thank you for your view, and I would be very grateful if you'd perhaps write an editorial for one of my journals explaining the reasons why nursing students need to have bursaries, over and above other students. What's the particular things that make this a necessity? Sadly, it seems a truth self-evident to them, and no one's ever taken me up on that challenge. They've just further insulted me. So that's how it can go. So just be aware and be warned. You're out there. Anybody can read your social media unless you make it private. If people are being offensive and simply won't stop, then the easiest thing is just to block them. And but don't do that too readily. Don't block people too readily. Try and engage them in discussion. I've had a few people who've perhaps come around to my way of thinking, but have come around to at least being friendly and at least appreciating my perspective. So that's a lot about me. Sorry, but it's just a good example from my own experience about social media. So being professional certainly involves never responding in kind, or in unkind, as it might be more strictly or accurately described. So just remember, on social media, to be responsible. Take responsibility for your own actions. You're the one that's going to get blamed for them. You won't be able to blame anyone else. So just be responsible and be professional. And I've given you some ideas about how to be professional. I think the diagram here says it all. You've got to be ethical. You've got to respect others. You will have a code. I mean, as a nurse, I've got the code of the Nursing and Midwifery Council. You've got the code of the General Medical Council to adhere to. You've got to be honest, and you've got to show integrity. For example, here's a teacher who showed a picture like this and ended up in severe trouble. I'm sure you're not going to do anything like this. I hope the image doesn't offend anyone, but it's up there, and it's just the sort of thing that you shouldn't do. So you got to remember your image and not show the public the wrong one. So here finally are some challenges for you. I don't know how many of you are ever going to get into blogging, but I would really encourage you to have a go at Twitter. So set up a Twitter account if you don't have one. Describe yourself in your profile accurately, honestly. Send out a tweet. Tweet an interesting link. See how much information you can get into 280 characters. That's the maximum on Twitter now. Remember, that's not words, that's characters. Try including a link there. And try including a picture. And tweet out a link from an online newspaper and see how that works. Remember, you can use Twitter on your phone, on your smartphone, or on your iPad, or on a desktop. There's no particular advantage or disadvantage to using it in any of those particular places. Slightly easier to type on the desktop, I have to say. And send out a link with a hashtag, and then click on the hashtag and see how your tweet has been added to that particular hashtag. For example, hashtag COVID-19. Send out something about the pandemic, and you'll see that your tweet has been gathered forever in all of the tweets related to that particular hashtag. That's everything. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found it useful. You're welcome to email me with comments or questions. You can check me on ORCID and find out more about my own research and publications by using that number on ORCID or by scanning the QR code. You can follow me on Twitter. If you follow me on Twitter and I realise who you are, I'll follow you back. And if you use WeChat, the Chinese social media platform, then you can scan that QR code and link with me on WeChat. Once again, thanks very much for listening.